So let me introduce our second guest speaker, Stuart Cunningham, who is a distinguished professor of media and communications at Queensland University of Technology in Australia. His experience, a list of publication and grants and projects is really long, so I will not go through it, but I will just mention that several key concepts of his later work is absolutely crucial for most of the topics we are discussing yesterday and today. AJ already mentioned the hidden innovation concept from the book Hidden Innovation, Policy, Industry and the Creative Sector. I would also mention Stuart's idea of the competition and collaboration between the IT and legacy media or Hollywood industries, and how their mutual relationship resulted in a new kind of entertainment products and industrial practices, which are very much linked to both online distribution and internet television, as we are discussing it today. And the latest product of Stuart's research and publication together with David Craig is a book called Social Media Entertainment, where he continues with the research started in the book on the new King Kongs of online world from 2013, and it develops further this idea of social media entertainment, a book with a subtitle, The New Industry at the Intersection of Hollywood and Silicon Valley, or Northern and Southern California. And I think this is the seminal book for us to understand what's happening between film and television on the one hand, social media and platforms more generally on the other hand. So thank you very much, Stuart, for coming here from far away, although you are attending and speaking at the ICA conference as well. So we are lucky to actually catch you from and to bring you from ICA to this pre-conference. Thank you very much for coming, for being with us here since yesterday, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. When Vicky said yesterday that she felt very sad for all those Americans who were flagging yesterday afternoon, I thought they've got no leg to stand on. I've come 22 and a half hours to this place. Anyway, that doesn't matter because it's fantastic to be here, and I really want to thank Peter and Johanna for the fantastic organisation of this two-day event. And you'll see in what I have to say today that there's really a lot of connection with the previous incredibly well curated panel on online television and internet television and online distribution, and Ira's final comments in which he raised the question of YouTube. Well, that's really what I'm going to be talking about in many ways today. So, challenge of social media entertainment for screen industries and policy. Let me take you back 10 years. In what has become a heavily cited paper, Jason Potts, John Hartley, Paul Ormerod and I proposed that social network markets might be a new way of understanding the contemporary creative industries. We posited that the creative industries are properly defined in terms of a class of economic choice theory, in which the predominant fact is that because of inherent novelty and uncertainty, decisions to both produce and consume are largely determined by the choice of others in a social network. Of course, the choices of others have been built into economic calculus since Veblen, but the affordances and network effects of digital networks scales such calculus to new heights. This was an attempt to move definitions of the creative industries away from concatenations of established industry sectors to a focus on indicators of emergence at the borderlands of the market economy. While it's a remarkable fact that many, if not most industries, started out as the hobbies or tinkering of enthusiastic amateurs or shunned obsessives, or through unpredicted breakthroughs, the liminal zone between the social and the market, not just in startup conditions, are the normal conditions in social network markets. These activities stay at the borderland between social networks and established markets. The social networks that are at the heart of these markets play at least as significant a coordination role as price signals. Creative industries' notorious radical uncertainty of demand that Art Devaney and Richard Caves have tracked is mitigated, or at least managed better, in social network markets. The policy implications of this definition move the attention from cultural economics' focus on market failure to a Schumpeterian focus on the apportionment of risk and uncertainty to the appropriate social domain best able to carry it, and to develop institutions that facilitate experimental behaviour and accommodate the dynamic costs of change. A major policy implication is that the digitally enabled end of the creative industries is dynamically interdependent with high-tech industries, and policy should focus not only on how new technologies affect the creative industries, but how the creative industries may affect the adoption and retention of new technologies. We already knew back then, 10 years ago, for example, that video games drove a good deal of the innovation cycle and business sustainability in console and computer hardware, for example. When we first termed the coin social network markets back in 2008, we might have posited its existence. At that time, what we had to talk about were MySpace, Second Life, and YouTube in its infancy, just after it had been bought by Google. But we could hardly have dreamed of the scale and consequence of what was brewing. Over the 10 years since that paper was published, a new proto-industry has emerged, about which I've now completed a major book with my collaborator David Craig from the University of Southern California. This is a study of the emergence and rapid evolution of a new creative industry, we think. It's taken us, David and I, to 10 countries on field research and included close to 170 interviews. It's taken us from the power elites of global entertainment in Beverly Hills to the alt centres of power like Facebook and Instagram at San Bruno, to the budget back rooms of individual vloggers, and perhaps in the highlight for me, to VidCon, which is now going to be in its 9th or 10th year. It attracts 8,000 or more fans and industry participants to Anaheim every year in LA. But for the first time last year, it was also run in Melbourne and in Amsterdam. And as I say, the high point, I think, for me was lining up for registration at the first Melbourne VidCon early one Saturday morning with what looked like a couple of, certainly several hundred 8 to 16-year-olds lining up in the registration line, which apparently I didn't have to do, but anyway I did. And someone walking down the line, he looked like a kind of 30-something kind of guy, said, "I'm really glad, I thought I'd be the oldest one here." So that's the kind of field research that we've been doing. So what's social media entertainment? Well, the emerging shape of screen industries, as we know in the 21st century, encapsulates deep changes in consumer habit, expectation, technology, and content production, and has been referred to by Jennifer Holt and Kevin Sanson as the trend, as part of a larger trend across the media industries to integrate digital technology and socially networked communication with traditional screen media practices. It's seen established players, norms, principles, and practices, ceding significant power and influence to powerful digital streaming and social networking platforms, obviously Apple, Amazon, Netflix, but also preeminently for this case, Google, YouTube. But along with others, obviously, on the social media end of the spectrum, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, and their Chinese counterparts. So we define social media entertainment as a proto-industry distinguished by native professionalising creators harnessing multiple platforms, engaging content innovation, aggregating global fan communities for commercial and cultural value. So just as notably, these platforms and the native content they're facilitating, commissioning and generating represent a greater value proposition to the advertising industry that has served as the bulwark for main media since the start of broadcasting 100 years ago. Creators in social media entertainment have harnessed these platforms to generate significantly different content, separate from the century-long model of intellectual property control and exploitation in the established content industries. Social media entertainment is driven by intrinsically interactive technologies and strategies of fans, viewers, audiences, and communities at a more fundamental level than we've seen before. Combined, these factors inform a qualitatively different globalization dynamic, untethered to traditional IP, at least in its fundamental distributional form, as original content travelling across legacy territories and jurisdictions with very little friction. Not no friction, but certainly relatively little friction. Social media entertainment has scaled with great velocity, posing new challenges for established screen companies, creatives, and regulatory regimes, and of course not least for media scholars. So as I hope to have said or shown to you, this industry is only a bit more than 10 years old, starting soon after the acquisition by Google of YouTube in 2006, and concurrent with the launch of Twitter and their counterparts in China, Youku and Weibo. By last year, by 2017, it has seen more than 3 million YouTube creators globally receiving some sort of remuneration from their uploaded content, and more than 5,000 YouTube professionalising amateur channels with at least 1 million subscribers and over 330 million video views. The top 5,000 YouTube channels have received over 250 billion views in aggregate, and the Recreate Coalition published a report earlier this year, late last year, in which they estimated almost $6 billion earned in the US alone off 9 social media platforms, social media entertainment platforms. It's evidently important to stress the distinction between social media entertainment content and platforms, and Hollywood-like content distributed and in some cases increasingly produced by what, of course, Amanda Lotz has called internet distributed television portals: Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, iTunes. These portals largely specialise in mainstream long-form premium content, supported by sophisticated algorithmic feedback to the portal itself. On the other hand, social media entertainment platforms offer scale, reach, technological affordance, remuneration and upskilling to previously amateur creators. We argue that social media entertainment potentially constitutes a more radical cultural and content challenge to established media than the digital streaming portals and the content that they auspice and increasingly produce. So, moving on to the part of the talk where I talk about policy challenges. This is going to be in 2 parts. Firstly, policy initiatives to support social media entertainment and the regulatory challenges that are posed by the new environment. So, as these new social network markets exploded around the world, and recognising that increasingly and especially young citizens are engaged online, government and public cultural agencies have started to engage and have begun to shore up local capacity to participate in global online culture. So, a couple of examples. In 2015, the Arts Council England recognised that it needed to assess the kind of contemporary art production it funded and take steps to make sure it reached where audiences are more likely to be. For this reason, it awarded £1.8 million to online distribution company Rightstar to deliver Canvas, an online digital arts hub or multi-channel network. Canvas is a program specifically not to make art, but to collate, curate and showcase content from UK leading arts organisations alongside original content. In Japan, YouTube partnered with Toei, a major Japanese producer and distributor of film and TV programs, in an initiative designed to help creators produce videos in the style of Japanese jidaigeki, or period drama. Google Canada and the Canadian Media Fund have partnered to develop a YouTube channel dedicated to showcasing original Canadian films. In the US, PBS Digital Studios earned 9.4 million subscribers in 2017, generating 800 million views with 30 million monthly views, and won 7 Webby Awards up till last year. PBS Digital Studios reaches a community of gamers, filmmakers and other creators with over 50 original web series, from arts to sciences to lifestyle. But as we've heard from Peter in the previous session, the biggest initiative that we also would agree with him, I think it's the biggest initiative we've found, is the establishment of Funk, an annual 45 million euro investment in online content services for young viewers from the German public broadcasters ARD and ZDF. As far as we can ascertain, as I've said, this is the largest public subvention of social media entertainment that we've seen so far. While coverage of this initiative has suggested that it is in part motivated by the need to create efficiencies due to fixed high costs in broadcasting, it involved the closure of ARD's 1 Plus and ZDF's Kultur. It is more fundamentally a response to the demographic crisis in public service media, and a decision, in the words of Thomas Ballard, who's the General Director of ZDF, to offer formats on the net in which young people are interested and make them available on the platforms they use. Indeed, a wide range of formats are supported, including news and critical analysis, satire, humour, science fiction. It's seen as balancing the over-preponderance of gaming in online culture in Germany, as well as a range of platforms. It pushes content to a range of platforms, including Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and the Funk app, as well as YouTube. For Annalena Mikus, program strategist at the YouTube Space in Berlin, who we interviewed last year, it's an opportunity to develop much more experimental web series. In her words, formats YouTubers always want to do but don't have the resources. In Australia, the Google and the National Screen Funding Agency, Screen Australia, launched Skip Ahead, which was aimed to provide local talent with the resources necessary to develop episodic scripted content for distribution via YouTube by providing funding and production resources. There have been 4 rounds of Skip Ahead to this year. Screen Australia select creators for the program, and those selected receive a share of jointly contributed seed funding, along with access to local production resources and an opportunity to network at the YouTube Space in Los Angeles. Australian creators who are actively engaged in creating new original content on YouTube and have built a substantial following are eligible to apply for funding. Screen Australia promoted the program as one that aimed to cultivate original Australian narrative-based content made specifically for global online audiences. With colleagues at QUT, I've analysed this. I've published some work on this, and some more work is coming out. We see it as a paradigmatic attempt to negotiate a relationship between online culture and established screen culture to bridge that yawning chasm. But the big issues really are around platform regulation and the implications for this form of content, and that's what I'll spend the rest of my time in this presentation on. You'll no doubt be aware that Phil Napoli and Robin Kaplan wrote a very important piece last year in First Monday I think that they've written a near definitive critique of the attempts by tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., not to be regarded and therefore potentially regulated as media companies. They forensically examine the implications of these tech companies being treated as media companies. They say it's no mere semantic distinction. They point to the increasingly dominant position that Facebook and Google have in both advertising revenue and in what they call the marketplace of ideas. The fact that this has rarely sparked a conversation, in their words, in US policy discourse can at least in part be attributed to the success thus far of the tech company, not media company rhetoric. But these platforms, they say, inevitably evolve in ways that make the technology company, not media company distinction even more invalid. For example, vertical integration into content creation and more interventionist curation. They conclude with this open-ended challenge to policymakers and media scholars that you see up there on the screen, which I won't read. Now, of course, as we all know, and as Phil and Robin know only too well, this case has been made for them very dramatically since they published that article. The events of the past 2 years, the information catastrophe around the US presidential election in November 2016, the adpocalypse, about which I'll say a bit more in a minute, and AJ referred to it in the previous session, the so-called adpocalypse of early 2017 ongoing, and the Cambridge Analytica scandal of early 2018 have definitively proved Napoli and Kaplan's case. Well before that, in Europe, state and supra-state actors have moved beyond sparking a conversation. They've acted to regulate and define substantially US platforms based on concerns about a wide array of their impacts and influence over the course now of almost a decade. These initiatives relate to tax, to privacy, to competition, and also to content. All of these have potential to impact the future environment in which social media entertainment operates, and the latter, content regulation, is of direct relevance to it. Now, when we talk about more regulation of the platforms, we need to be careful that we don't get into a sort of overgeneralized debate about, well, we need to break down what is often an overgeneralized call for more regulation and come to terms with the highly differentiated initiatives that have been taken and that are likely to be able to be taken. So there's initiatives around tax avoidance and minimisation. This has a broadly based multi-jurisdictional potency around the world. There is imminent application of anti-tax minimisation measures by the platforms in Australia and many other jurisdictions. And these moves often have the highest priority amongst policymakers, certainly in the country that I come from. There are interventions against anti-competitive practices, and the EU has been best practice in this area, and I'll mention a couple of examples of that. There are interventions on grounds of social norms and human rights, the right to be forgotten in Europe, so central questions about privacy, cyberbullying and identity theft have all been centrally issues for concern. There's activity against citizenship rights and democracy, obviously the implications that will unfold hopefully in the US as a result of the Cambridge Analytica and Russian interference catastrophes will unfold. There are questions of news values and the crisis in journalism, and many initiatives around the world, and I will touch on a couple of those in respect of Australia in a minute. And the point that I'm trying to make is that questions about entertainment content often come down the bottom of this rather long list of priorities in policymakers' minds. So let's review just briefly some of the European state and supra-state actions. So France fined Facebook €150,000 for alleged privacy violations. Several other EU countries are investigating the company's privacy practices. In 2016, the EU ordered Apple to pay 13 billion euros, about 14.5 billion US at the time, plus interest in back taxes, saying that Ireland had given the company preferential tax treatment. The EU also filed a formal antitrust complaint against Google over its Android operating system in 2016, arguing that requiring handset makers to include Google's apps on Android phones was unfair to competitors. The EU also fined Google $2.7 billion US dollars in 2017, ruling that its preferential treatment of its own content, that is the Google Shopping, was illegal and anti-competitive. And one commentator referring to this particular action said not only was this a very large fine, but it was also an order for Google to essentially change the way it handles search. At the nation-state level, Germany stands out with strict requirements for Werbung or promotional declarations for online creators and the resolute stance of the state-authorised collecting society and performing rights organisation GEMA to refuse to apply principles enshrined in the US DMCA Act, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, to provide safe harbour, instead regarding YouTube as liable when it hosts copyrighted videos without the copyright holder's permission. This 7-year standoff was partially resolved in late 2016 when YouTube agreed to an undisclosed rate at which GEMA members would be remunerated for video streams. France has signalled its intent to apply national expenditure quotas on streamers, diverting the money to support French films, but Germany got in ahead of them and has just announced this in April that it will require Netflix to financially support national content. Sorry, in May, it was only a week or so ago, to financially support national content and reveal subscriber numbers and revenues from that market. And of course, the European Commission, in updating the 2010 Audiovisual Media Services Directive, has proposed a 20% European content quota on SVOD services, with the European Parliament upping the ante to 30% and widening the scope to include social media services. So you probably know most of those instances, but put the European situation in a global context, and it's a different frame. For liberal democracies outside the Eurozone, there is little to no track record of actual policy action to regulate platforms as emerging media companies. Of course, there are very clear models for regulation, or the lack of it, outside of Europe. There is the US model, with its reluctance to regulate based on Schumpeterian but also culturally imperialistic notions of innovation. Even that secular saint of the moderate left, President Barack Obama, called the EU actions against US platforms protectionism. It's worth looking at this quote from Obama. Americans have owned the internet. We own the internet. Our companies have created it, expanded it, perfected it in ways that European companies can't compete. Oftentimes what's portrayed as high-minded positions on issues sometimes is just designed to carve out some of their commercial interests. Well, do tell. Commercial interests might be behind such things. The US regulatory model is traditionally one based on competition, innovation, and national champions. We've heard about this in the previous panel. So antitrust principles of competition within the US now much weakened, and state support for industry outside the US, following time-honoured principles established for Hollywood from the 1920s, as film historians Thomas Guback and Christian Thompson have shown. This is underlined in the exquisite symmetry of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, with its shoring up of the ability of established media hegemons to continue to extract copyright rents while further criminalising attempts to circumvent strong copyright control, while at the same time, in the same act, through the safe harbour provisions, curating the conditions for the new generation of US digital hegemons, operating on quite distinct principles of aggregation and spreadability rather than control, IP control. There is quite simply a fundamental Atlantic fault line within with the US assessing monopoly behaviour in the context largely of consumer welfare and finding it hard not to find consumer welfare benefit as many of the services provided by the platforms are free. Now, that's classical economics, and I suppose US regulators guided by the new realities are going to have to get their heads around, you know, the statement that we well know: if you are not paying for the product, you are the product. At the extreme other end of the spectrum, there's the North Korean model, which enforces outright bans, and the model practiced by new models of regulation I'm talking about on a global comparative base. So outright bans, and the model practiced by numerous Middle Eastern countries, which involves temporary bans around elections and other times of political and religious unrest. Then, of course, there's the Chinese model, autarkic, highly surveilled, but dynamic development made viable by the vast domestic user base in that country. For the smaller nations, liberal democracies, so I did get to small nations, and I will talk a fair bit about a small nation that I come from, Australia, in a minute. For the smaller nation liberal democracies, there are seen to be real difficulties regulating foreign entities and applying path-dependent regulatory models modelled on linear broadcasting. There must also be a calculus based on innovation and the platform's roles in it that continues to be the case, even as they have grown very large and now are known to be very vulnerable to organised hacking, as we saw with the US presidential election. The fact is that any regulation of social media services, as distinct from traditional film and television professional content served up by the streamers, the portals, first requires acknowledgement that platforms perform constant and widespread self-regulation in response to takedown notices, obviously concerning copyright, but as well, they spend a lot of time avoiding controversy over content offending community standards by dealing with such blights online as hate speech and revenge porn. It's estimated that Google alone handles about 80 million takedown notices a month globally for copyright claims alone. That's not to add all the others. Much of any new regulation of the platforms will of necessity need to be co-regulation. So where does social media entertainment fit in all of this? Well, the short answer is often down the bottom of a very long list of priorities that I've already spoken about. Now, this is where I talk a little about the adpocalypse of 2017. With the adpocalypse, we've seen the unintended consequences of knee-jerk platform self-regulation. The so-called adpocalypse that started last year saw Google and Facebook racing to recover from major premium brands withdrawing their advertising when it was revealed that their programmatic, that is algorithmically driven advertising, had sometimes been placed beside extremist, even Nazi content. The platform's brand safety responses to the adpocalypse has seen many minority creators demonetized, particularly LGBT creators and players of such games as Assassin's Creed, whose metadata was ultra quickly flagged as not brand safe. It's also seen concerted pushback from leading creators against the platforms and ongoing campaigns to restabilise revenue streams for thousands of creators. Regulatory responses need to deal, in the light of the adpocalypse and the unintended consequences that flowed from it, regulatory responses need to deal with the crucial social and cultural distinctions between online activity for good, involving new business models and new voices, which are much more gender, racial and geographically diverse than film and television. We write a chapter in the book about this. And the organised assault on democratic interests we see from the alt-right. Critical distinctions that need to be made in this space. Now, apart from that, why is social media entertainment important in the context of the current crisis in platform governance? Well, I've already talked about its potential progressive cultural politics. In the light of the Oscars So White imbroglio of 2016, Mashable did a survey of diversity in the major entertainment formats, and they awarded a D to film, a C to television, a C to gaming, and an A to digital entertainment of the sort that I'm talking about. It's important this is a space of potentially progressive cultural politics. It's a space of IP innovation. And if you read a book like Robert Kinkle, who's a YouTube executive, called Streampunks, YouTube and the Rebels Remaking Media, you'll see that the history of the platforms, as Winston Churchill said, is at least attempted to be written by the victors. This account by Kinkle of YouTube's success almost completely writes out or deprioritizes the centrality of social media entertainment creators, their centrality in YouTube's success. There's very little mention of how when YouTube went traditional, that is, over those 10 years, they've made many, many serious pitches to Hollywood to come on board and have largely failed. It's a history that shows that YouTube didn't preference these SME creators from the start by any means, but they have learnt that is where their real brand identity and company success comes from. In Kinkle's account, you just won't find that. So I want to talk a bit about the pragmatics of policy development in my small country. So this suite of issues that I've talked about are being played out, but relatively sotto voce in Australia. And the fact is that in order of priority, dealing with tax minimisation is the highest priority for policymakers, and as I've said, there's some imminent action occurring around that. The second probably is the advertising market and the threats to the advertising market of Google and Facebook, that big sucking sound that we can all hear as the advertising dollar or the crown exits traditional broadcasting and finds its way into the platform's pockets. So there's a big competition inquiry going on in the country at the moment about the ways in which the advertising market may be being distorted. The third priority is around news and journalism. So it's a risibly small amount, but $60 million were bartered in a move around media reform legislation last year. $60 million set aside to support regional and independent and investigative journalism, given the threat to these forms of journalism that we see as massive job losses in publishing, in newspapers and in journalism. And content, about which there is another inquiry, the Australian Content and Children's Review, which I'll say a bit about in a minute, that's going on at the moment as well, but really from a priority point of view of where government is going to spend political capital, it's well down. Also, Australia is a policy taker rather than a policy setter in international terms. So, to my mind, it's a case of the judo move, using the greater power of your antagonist to bring him or her to the canvas. And the canvas, in this case, is engagement with existing national, cultural and industry policy initiatives. I'm talking now about the prospects for content and policy around content. To the engagement, getting the platforms to engage with existing national, cultural and industry policy initiatives to further influence and assist in post-broadcast models of cultural sustainability. So it's in that context that this review, the Australian Content and Children's Review, is going on. And I worked with an experienced corporate lawyer who also happens to be the head, the president of the Australian Documentary Foundation, which sources non-cultural subsidy sources of money for issues-based documentary. This person, Ian McGill, and I developed a proposal that looked holistically at the broader ecology of broadcasting, streaming services, public media, and the new green shoots of social media entertainment. This issue has been around for a while. You don't need to look at the detail of this, but in 2012, a major convergence review recommended a principles-based approach to regulation for Australian and local content in the context of drawing red lines under what must not be deregulated, the three pillars of undue concentration of media ownership, media content standards, social norms across all platforms, and the production and distribution of Australian and local content. So this 2012 exercise developed a flexible technology and platform neutral approach to regulating for Australian content, and it's similar in some respects to the initiatives that we see now around regulating the streamers for professional content that I've already canvassed in Europe, and of course some similarities as well to the Big Bang Creative Canada policy developments, which, as Ira spoke about yesterday, included the $500 million deal, Netflix deal. We're highly supportive of these kinds of initiatives. We also want to see green shoots, social media entertainment style content built into support strategies. So what have we done to do that? Our proposal is to adopt in a careful, evidence-based transition away from reliance on broadcast quotas an incentives-based model for the production of Australian content, which depends on a public-private funds development partnership under the umbrella of a new Australian Screen Content Fund. The key elements in this proposal are to attract into the screen content space a new level of involvement of funds management expertise designed to grow the pie, while also making the pie increasingly contestable, driving future-oriented, innovative content strategies which build towards a post-linear broadcast vision of broad-scale popular screen culture. The fund would have sufficient liquidity, it would have new funding, but also funding diverted from existing programs, plus spectrum fees paid by broadcasters, and social benefit bonds and public ancillary funds to invest and generate returns on a sovereign wealth model and ultimately move towards self-sufficiency. If the fund was seen to be working well, attracting new sources of funding and engaging new viewerships and helping to support innovative new voices and new business models, it would be expected that platforms and streaming services would also invest in it. These could include an expectation of reciprocity on the part of larger stakeholders. Investment in the fund gives rights of access to the fund. In developing this recommendation, we hope to secure some common ground for major reform. Investment models are something that most stakeholders can agree in principle on, while more or less regulation is something very few in the pragmatics of policy exchange can agree on. We look to grow the pie, to stimulate the screen production sector through access to high-quality funds management expertise, and to draw expert funds managers and creative funding methodologies into supporting the sector. The proposal is fully technology neutral and stimulates contestability and innovation. We see the synergies that could be established across the divisions within this fund, the divisions of film, television, documentary, social media entertainment, as and their interdependencies are as highly innovative. This is an opportunity for business expertise to structurally contribute to the sustainability of future cultural production, rather than businesses' relationship to culture being mediated mostly through philanthropy. So, look, to sum up, last words. So I've tried to track over, both in theoretical terms over the last 10 years, the positing of a notion of social network markets that have in an astounding way have come true in terms of social media entertainment. I've tried to track the broad international policy landscape, comparing the extremely layered European experience of where the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the single market, overlays the Eurozone, major state action in the Eurozone as well. I've tried to compare that to the very thin, either we have authoritarian models in other parts of the world, or very much minimalist liberal democratic models. How does all that play out in relation to each other? And I've tried to make some comments about the need for media scholars to really drill down into the more regulation question, and to really focus in on what's achievable at particular times in particular moments. And I've tried to give one example of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, for the presentation, which connected some inspiring theoretical concepts with quite practical proposals on regulation and policy making, actually dragging us out of the European, box and making us confront what we know about Europe with, Australia and the US and other non-European countries. What I admire in your work is how you actually work with the policymakers for many years without losing your cultural studies critical perspective. So that's probably what makes you also sensitive to issues like, creators and their careers, rather than thinking purely in economic terms. So this is very inspiring, and also your proposal on how to approach subsidy programs of film funds and similar institutions towards online content creators is quite inspiring, because there is some discussion going on in several European countries, including the Czech one, and I think we had a while ago two representatives of we still have two representatives of the State Film Fund from Czech Republic here, so there might be some interesting parallels and inspiration to discuss these policy-making proposals. So now the floor is open for discussion, so your questions, please.
Thank you so much for that really informative, expansive talk. I have a question about the last part about the fund in Australia, and how do you foresee return on investment for that? And because I imagine these platforms would invest for a return, and yeah, how might that work?
Thank you, AJ. It's very much an aspirational proposal. Ian McGill, the corporate lawyer that I referred to, and who with me developed this proposal, the most interesting part about it was, where do you get new funds from that aren't just cultural subsidy funds? And social innovation and public ancillary funds are sources of finance which can tap essentially the philanthropy market, and have their own dynamics of how you develop ROI. So we've basically flying on the backs of these kinds of experiences. I'm not the person who developed this part of the proposal. The other guy was, for obvious reasons. He's the corporate lawyer with the experience of how to access. His work with the Australian Documentary Foundation, which is dedicated to finding non-cultural subsidy sources of finance for issues-based documentary, has given him a good basis for how to tap those funds. Now, it's not commercial ROI that we're talking about here. It's about broadening the base outside of what is almost always in all jurisdictions a fairly static cultural subsidy envelope. How to increase that with other sources of funds. So the short answer is there's not an elaborated ROI. But it may well have to develop one if we're to seriously engage the platform's interests.
Yes, I have a question about regulation. As you stated, the United States, Australia have not really made serious attempts to rein in the power of these big platforms, Google, Facebook, etc. But Europe has, from my understanding, mostly on anti-competitive and anti-monopoly grounds, not really media regulation grounds to a certain extent. Do you see in the long view that the breaking up, such as the NYU scholar Scott Galloway advocates to literally break up these monopolies through either making individual state versions of them or breaking them up and interrupting this seemingly unstoppable force?
Well, there's certainly some serious work out there about breaking up, and antitrust initiatives. And there's, I'm not sure, I haven't read the original work by this scholar that you're referring to, but I think I've read the summary of her work, his work.
It's Scott Galloway, New York University.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the scholar, him or herself, but I am. I think I'm pretty. The piece that The Economist did at the start of this year on that canvassed a lot of these issues. The very important questions about particularly Facebook's ability to have neutralised competition in its space with the purchase of WhatsApp, Instagram. I mean, dramatic decrease in competition. And the prospect, and it's not out of the question, the prospect of requiring for those entities to be decoupled under antitrust activity is something that definitely needs to be considered and definitely needs to be held as a sort of Damocles over these platforms. I mean, as we heard yesterday, I mean, the appalling lack of perspicacity in the congressional hearings of Zuckerberg doesn't give us a lot of hope, but there is there's certainly a lot of work going on around those kinds of questions. And interestingly, in that article I'm referring to from The Economist, because I'm not an expert in this field, I'm being clear where I'm getting my idea from. That piece from January this year talked about the fact that, okay, the attempts to move antitrust against Microsoft didn't happen, but it did produce a number of results that, for example, there was a lot of patent sharing that came out of the move against antitrust moves against Microsoft way back in the 90s. And the argument in this article was that the ability to access those patents have helped to grow the next range of competitors to Microsoft, who themselves, of course, become hegemonic. So, yeah, I think that antitrust has to be really looked at very, very seriously. even if it is, as I say, a sort of Damocles kind of strategy.
Thanks, very interesting talk. You mentioned the apocalypse disaster of 2017, where many advertisers withdrew their advertising investments from certain ad agencies in response to finding that their ads had, through programmatic transactions, shown up in embarrassing places on racist websites. And I think you made the point that that underlines the argument for more effective regulation. Just wonder whether a fair other way to look at it might be that it demonstrates that this actually demonstrates the potential for self-regulation based on leveraging the reputational self-interest of advertisers to propel better governance. I'm thinking that, you know, at the moment there is an initiative amongst newspapers internationally through the IAB to choke off the revenues that are going to fake news sites by simply not allowing the sale of advertising through supply-side platforms that goes to these. And this is, advertisers are signing up to it because of, you know, concerns about the reputation. So the question really is, you know, to what extent can reputational concerns of advertisers be an effective lever, a more useful lever in securing better governance of SMEs?
The answer is resounding yes. This has been the most effective slap in the face for the platforms that they've had in their history. They live. I mean, we know where Google and Facebook get their money from. 98%, I think, of Facebook's revenue is advertising. They are really. They have a very imbalanced revenue portfolio, and when particularly big multinational brand advertisers decide that they're a bad smell, they are going to respond, and they did. The adpocalypse shows that they are heavily into that we've always known that they're heavy self-regulators, but it's just that we haven't paid a lot of attention to, I suppose, that. I mean, 80 million takedown notices a month. Yes, a lot of this is about bad stuff, about, you know, overreaction to copyright claims, but they are massive interveners in their programmatic streams. They're massive interveners in it, and it's got bigger and bigger and bigger as the pressure has grown. So self-regulation is definitely going to be a much quicker, more effective means, but it has to come from the commercial titans, and that's where you know, consumer-driven campaigns that really motivate advertisers to continue to place this kind of pressure is very important. My main focus I totally agree with all of that. My main focus was in the talk was to say the little person in this has been squeezed very badly as well, because as soon as you get massive overreaction, as you did with the adpocalypse, you've got people who are doing edgy content found that they were suddenly without any money and without any revenue. So that has to be factored in to that overwhelmingly positive account of the importance of self-regulation as an effective bulwark against platform power.
Thank you for your talk. I have one question. We now experience in the Czech Republic ongoing debate on so-called value gap. It means that online consumption of copyright-protected content is rising on the one hand, but the revenues for copyright holders or creators are declining. So that's called value gap. European Commission is trying to deal with that, and one of the proposals is that the hosting platforms which are operating under the safe harbor and which are supposed to be one of the cause of this value gap should implement upload filters. That's one solution. The other one is that the cooperation between the hosting platforms which enable the access to copyright protected content, and the copyright holders should be improved by so-called Institute of Trusted Flaggers. It means people who are reliable in noticing the content which is infringing the copyright. So do you have similar debates in Australia, or how do you regulate these hosting platforms?
Yes, it's obviously not familiar with the detail of what those particular examples of yours, but of course, this comes under the general umbrella of, analog dollars, digital cents is another way of talking about, the value gap. And obviously it's also often conflated with, and I don't know whether you would do this or not, but conflated with in the copyright lobby with piracy. So it's a murky field. Look, let me, without really answering directly your question, because I'm not sure of the detail of the Czech initiatives, but let me just stress that the field that I'm talking about, the social media entertainment space, is a space where original content is being created, very, very low budget original content, that is initially supported through programmatic advertising. But, and on that basis, there are no jurisdictional, territorial, legacy constraints around it of the sort that we've heard a lot about with in Derek's and others' talks this morning. This content, by and large, travels around the world in a relatively frictionless way, but more traditional IP becomes important to the creator once they realise that no matter how many million views they might get, it's not enough. It's not going to generate enough money to give up your day job or to take this as a serious, develop this as a serious career. So you move from a moment of original content that is not IP controlled to a more conventional suite of IP options around merchandising, licensing, live appearances, not necessarily an IP play, but certainly live appearances at VidCon and all of these places, along with book sales. A lot of these creators have written books about their lives, their 18 and 19-year-old lives, which are on the New York Times bestseller list. So more conventional IP plays, but not initially in the creator career arc. I know that's not really an answer to your question, but it is one where I'm stressing where the value gaps lie for these creators.
Just to follow up on the kind of self-regulation point, you didn't mention, I don't think you mentioned hate speech laws and to what extent that might intersect with how these platforms self-regulate. Because it seems to me that there's a kind of, they're censoring on both ends, right? The sort of radical right and maybe radical left as well. And it seems to me that at least U.S. hate speech laws, which of course are like local and state and federal, might condone the censorship of sort of extremist white supremacist work, but might actually account for the ways in which minority voices need to be able to speak to their specific experiences. Because, I just think about like the first episode of Brown Girls is, there's like a lesbian scene, 2 women of color, a fat person who's naked, like that would get taken down off YouTube. And that's why I don't publish on YouTube. I lose all the data.
Yeah. There's no, as I was watching your content, I was thinking, you're not going to get that kind of stuff in the SME space. And look, there's a lot of controversy about that in the sense of let's say LGBT representation in the SME space is pretty sanitized, relatively speaking. It's not particularly diverse, even though it's diverse. It's not like diverse in the sense that is really pushing the envelope. And there have been various scholars in particular who have been very critical of it for that reason. Look, I did mention hate speech and revenge porn and a whole bunch of really like content that is being self-regulated all the time. and decisions on that are pushed back on by creators all the time as well. And when you get into the actual nitty-gritty of that and the how successful are creators in being able to have content takedowns reviewed, the power asymmetries involved in that, the workloads involved in that. That has been an absolutely endemic question in the space from day one, and you're well. I mean, you've written about some of this, in earlier, some of the most important work that was done on early YouTube. You wrote about, some of those upsides and downsides of the space, AJ.
I may have a question as well about the French case. You mentioned, I think you were referring to the French National Cinema Center and how it actually taxes YouTube and others. So French Cinema Center is perceived as a kind of sort of pioneer by other policy-making institutions in Europe. And also it's actually ahead of the new Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which is introducing this 30% quota and so-called prominence of European content, and also the possibility to collect fees nationally by the national funds. What the French Center does is not just taxing YouTube, but also, as far as I know, launching programs to train YouTubers and to actually bring its own values into how these YouTube, production could be somehow brought closer to public agenda. So, what is your view of these initiatives?
Well, yes, and I think I gave a number of examples of that. Funk is clearly an example of that. I mean, the money comes from the public broadcasters. The public, it's a classic, PSB to PSM kind of move. And talking to the folk at the Berlin YouTube space is very clear that they want to produce a whole range of content that balances the commercially driven realities of gaming as a predominant online form in Germany. So I'm not as familiar with what's happened, how successful the French initiative is. But yes, these are public service. This is cultural pedagogy. This is important stuff of the sort that we've heard a lot about in the earlier panel. Populist. I mean, Peter, your point about stream is really very relevant here. The content is populist, but it's progressive, and that's the kind of thing that I think is needed. And of course the example that I gave of Skip Ahead in Australia is a fascinating example when you look at it up close, because they're trying to take YouTubers who are producing classic very low budget YouTube content, blogging, gameplay, DIY content, other kinds of content, and seeing how far you can push towards scripted narrative. And in some cases they've gone a long way, in other cases they haven't gone very far at all, because the reality is that the viability of scripted content is purely on grounds of outside of cultural subsidy. It's very difficult to make work. This is one of the, I suppose, one of the foundational assumptions in the social media entertainment space. Hank and John Green, the Vlog brothers, who are the sort of thought leaders in this space, made it very clear early on that they were pioneers of early US web series before, there was hardly a cent in the field, and they moved out of it because of its non-viability in this kind of commercial space that we've been tracking. So the whole web series phenomenon that you and AJ were talking about this morning that is pushing YouTubers towards that is a two-edged sword. It can work, and they can develop very interesting long-form creativity. In many cases, it doesn't work.
Sorry, this is my jam. So you mentioned the Vlogbrothers. I know that I feel like it was them, they started something called like the Internet Creators Guild, which I never followed up on. I like mentioned it briefly in my book, but are there efforts of unionization or coordination?
We interviewed the 20-something director of the Internet Creators Guild a couple of weeks ago, Anthony D'Angelo, and he just graduated from USC. The Internet Creators Guild, I mean, he's great, but young. Internet Creators Guild has about 700 members. It charges $60 a year to join. It's a tiny organisation, but it's got some very big names on the board, and it is out there, as a guild should, is defending creator rights in a whole series of spaces. With the platforms, with the press, trying to explain the reality of this field as a legitimate media industry to the press. They see that as very important. And to their members, they're trying to gather lots and lots of data about, they're doing a big survey at the moment of what the membership profile looks like and what they can do. But of course, it's a very, very small start. And of course, in this space, there's the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Organisation for Transformative Works, and there's a bit of work. There's a couple of people who work in the Producers Guild for creators, and of course the Recreate Coalition, which I mentioned, their research work. Interestingly, that Recreate report that I drew on has a very politically savvy structure, because they report on all the they've broken down by state, by US state, all 50 of them, the basic data on creator presence and creator activity state by state. So it becomes a sort of lobbying document for state and as well as federal legislators. So it's a space that's under development, but it needs to get stronger and grow, and that's research we're doing right now. Yeah.
Okay. If there are no more urgent questions, I suppose we are all hungry already. So it's about time to go to lunch and to reconvene here 2:30 for the next or the third keynote of the conference. So thank you very much for your attention.